It was a morning that felt unusually tense. The city streets were crowded with people going about their usual routines, but there was an undercurrent of unease. In homes and small cafes, people whispered about recent incidents involving the police, and there was a sense that something important was about to happen. Everyone knew the Chief Justice was attending an important public ceremony that day. He had always been a figure of respect, someone who had spent years making decisions that affected the lives of thousands. Yet even his supporters could feel the tension in the air. The Chief Justice prepared for the day with calm determination. He dressed in his usual formal attire, carefully ensuring everything was in place. The weight of his responsibilities often made him pause and reflect, and today was no different. He thought about the people who trusted the law to protect them, the cases he had judged, and the importance of maintaining justice and fairness. There was pride in his heart, but also an awareness that the world he lived in could sometimes be unpredictable. Outside, his convoy moved slowly through the streets. Officers who were part of his security detail were vigilant, scanning the roads ahead. Civilians went about their day, but there were occasional glances toward the Chief Justice's motorcade, a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Despite the routine nature of these processions, the Chief Justice felt a subtle tension, a feeling that something might go wrong. He could not shake it off entirely, but he continued to focus on the tasks ahead. As the convoy turned a corner, traffic seemed to halt unexpectedly. A group of police officers had formed a blockade on the street. Their presence was firm and intimidating. The Chief Justice's driver slowed down and tried to communicate with the officers. Questions were asked, voices raised, but there was no clear explanation for the sudden stop. The Chief Justice, seated in the back of the car, could hear the voices of his security detail trying to negotiate, their tones sharp yet cautious. Then, without warning, one officer approached the vehicle and opened the door. The Chief Justice looked up in shock. This was not a routine traffic stop. Something was very wrong. The officer motioned for him to step out. Confusion, fear, and disbelief coursed through him. He had never imagined being in such a situation, especially not in front of so many people who were beginning to notice the commotion. As he stepped out, hands slightly raised to show compliance, he spoke in a calm but firm voice, asking what the matter was. His questions were met with silence or vague gestures. The crowd that had gathered murmured among themselves, some recording videos on their phones, trying to understand what was happening. The Chief Justice felt the eyes of strangers on him, a mixture of concern and curiosity. His heart beat faster, not just from fear, but from the realization that the law, which he had upheld for so many years, was now being used against him in a way that felt deeply personal. The officers moved quickly to handcuff him. Shock and disbelief paralyzed him for a moment. He had spent decades ensuring that justice was applied fairly, and now he was being restrained by the very system he had trusted. The Chief Justice's voice, normally commanding and assured in courtrooms, now trembled slightly as he begged for an explanation. He asked them to reconsider, to understand who he was and what his role represented, but the officers did not respond. There the Chief Justice sat quietly, his mind steady even as the tension in the room seemed to thicken with every passing minute. Outside, the city moved on as usual, but inside the police station, time seemed to slow. The waiting area was stark and silent, except for the occasional shuffle of papers and murmured conversations of officers nearby. The Chief Justice reflected on the surreal nature of his situation, how quickly the balance of power could shift, and how vulnerable even the highest authority could become when human prejudice intervened. He looked around the room, observing the officers and staff, reading their body language, noticing subtle gestures of doubt, unease, and hesitation. Some were young and uncertain, perhaps feeling the weight of detaining someone so important. Others carried an air of false confidence, trying to mask any worry or doubt. But the Chief Justice could sense the tension beneath their composed exteriors. He understood that human beings often wore masks, and recognizing those masks allowed him to navigate the situation more effectively. The Chief Justice sat in the quiet of the holding room, his mind alert yet calm, aware that the ordeal was reaching its final stages. Every hour had tested his patience and resilience, but he remained steadfast. His hands rested lightly on the table, steady and unshaken, a testament to his determination to face each moment with dignity and composure. He understood that the culmination of this incident could have lasting effects, not just on him personally, but on the principles of justice and authority he represented. Outside the room, footsteps echoed, voices whispered, and the atmosphere was charged with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. The Chief Justice observed the movements carefully, noting subtle cues from officers who passed by or lingered near the doorway. He recognized that their actions, conscious or unconscious, reflected their awareness of the gravity of the situation. Despite the tension, he maintained a sense of calm authority, knowing that composure often influences outcomes more than confrontation. An officer approached, carrying documents and speaking in a measured tone. The Chief Justice greeted him politely, acknowledging the effort and responsibility the officer carried. He responded to questions thoughtfully, never defensive, never aggressive. His approach was deliberate, aiming to balance respect, authority, and moral clarity. The officer listened attentively, occasionally nodding, clearly influenced by the Chief Justice's calm and reasoned manner. As he waited for further decisions, the Chief Justice reflected on the personal dimensions of this experience. He thought about the humiliation of being handcuffed, the vulnerability of being at the mercy of those who had chosen to ignore rank and law, and the strange reversal of roles that left him feeling powerless. Yet he also recognized the opportunity for introspection and growth. He understood that enduring injustice with dignity could inspire others, demonstrate the strength of character, and reinforce the principles he had devoted his life to upholding. Time passed slowly, each minute weighed down by anticipation. The Chief Justice continued to observe, listen, and process every detail of his surroundings. He noticed the tension among the officers, the hesitancy in their movements, and the occasional whispered consultation. It was evident that the unusual nature of the situation had unsettled even the most confident of them. The Chief Justice remained silent during these moments, using observation as a tool to understand the human behavior around him and to prepare for the next steps. Eventually, a more senior officer entered the room, accompanied by another individual whose presence seemed authoritative and deliberate. The Chief Justice stood, acknowledging them with a calm, composed greeting. He listened as the senior officer explained that a formal review of the incident had been conducted and that certain measures were being implemented. The Chief Justice's responses were measured and thoughtful, aimed at clarifying procedures, understanding next steps, and ensuring accountability. He maintained an air of quiet authority, demonstrating that composure and reason could prevail even in the face of adversity. As the conversation continued, the Chief Justice began to sense a shift in the room. The tone of the officers became more subdued, their gestures more cautious and their expressions more reflective. It was as if the prolonged presence of someone who embodied dignity, patience, and authority had influenced their perception and behavior. The Chief Justice realized that endurance and measured conduct could gradually alter the dynamics of even the most challenging situations. He took a moment to reflect internally. He considered the broader societal implications of the incident, the need for accountability within law enforcement, and the importance of maintaining public trust in institutions. He thought about the citizens watching from outside, the journalists reporting, and the colleagues in the judiciary who would be affected by the outcome. He understood that his actions and demeanor during this experience could have a ripple effect, influencing perceptions of justice and integrity far beyond the walls of this station. The Chief Justice also reflected on the personal lessons embedded in this ordeal. Humility, patience, observation, and resilience had been tested at the highest levels. He recognized that authority is not only defined by position, but by the ethical and moral choices one makes when challenged. By remaining composed and principled, he had not only maintained his own dignity, but had subtly reminded those around him of the responsibility inherent in power and enforcement. After what felt like hours, the Chief Justice was informed that he would be released and that the officers involved in his detention would undergo a formal review for their actions. Relief and a quiet satisfaction washed over him, tempered by reflection on the gravity of the situation and the importance of ensuring that such an incident would not occur again. He prepared himself to leave the room, maintaining his posture, his composure, and his dignity. Every step, every gesture was deliberate, reinforcing the authority and presence he had carried throughout his career. As he was escorted toward the exit, The Chief Justice observed the faces of the officers and staff around him. Some displayed genuine remorse or embarrassment, others a reluctant recognition of wrongdoing. The Chief Justice remained calm, acknowledging their presence with subtle nods, a silent reminder that accountability was not about punishment alone, but about reflection, learning, and ethical responsibility. Outside the room, the city continued its rhythms, unaware of the quiet drama that had unfolded within the station. The Chief Justice emerged into the light, breathing deeply, feeling a sense of release, yet also carrying the weight of reflection. He thought about the broader implications of the incident, the necessity for reform, and the enduring importance of justice, fairness, and ethical conduct in all institutions. He addressed a small gathering of colleagues and reporters who had waited outside, speaking with clarity, composure, and measured authority. He emphasized the importance of accountability, the need for vigilance in upholding justice, and the responsibility of those entrusted with power. His words were not just a reflection on his own experience, but a call for systemic awareness and reform. The Chief Justice's calm presence, thoughtful reflection, and moral clarity left a profound impression on those who heard him. As the day drew to a close, the Chief Justice reflected on the journey he had endured. The arrest, the humiliation, the waiting, and the observation had tested his patience, resilience, and understanding of human behavior. Yet, through it all, he had maintained his dignity, projected authority, and upheld the principles of justice that defined his life's work. The experience reinforced his belief that integrity, composure, and principled action are powerful tools, capable of influencing even the most challenging and unjust circumstances. In the end, the Chief Justice's ordeal became more than a personal trial. It became a symbol of resilience, ethical conduct, and the enduring importance of justice. By facing adversity with dignity, maintaining calm authority, and reflecting deeply on human behavior and institutional responsibility, he demonstrated that true power lies not in dominance or aggression, but in integrity, patience, and principled action. His story would serve as a lesson to many, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, one can act with courage, clarity, and unwavering commitment to what is right. When one of the senior officers entered, the Chief Justice stood, maintaining his composure. He greeted the officer calmly, using a tone that was firm yet respectful. The Chief Justice remained in the room, seated at the small table, his posture calm and composed even as the minutes stretched into hours. The room, plain and unadorned, felt oppressive at times, but he had learned that discomfort was part of life, and enduring it with dignity was essential. He focused on his breathing, allowing himself to remain centered despite the stress that threatened to creep in. Every sound, the distant murmur of officers, the shuffle of papers, the hum of fluorescent lights, was a reminder of the environment he was in, and he observed it all carefully. Officers came and went, occasionally glancing at him with uncertainty or curiosity. Some carried themselves with confidence, attempting to assert control, but even they seemed aware of the unusual nature of the situation. The Chief Justice understood that authority was not just about rank. It was also about perception, presence, and composure. By maintaining his calm and deliberate demeanor, he continued to influence the room, subtly shaping the attitudes and reactions of those around him. At one point, an officer brought in a form of paperwork for him to review and sign. The Chief Justice examined it meticulously, noting the language used and any inconsistencies or ambiguities. He knew that careful attention to detail could make a difference later, both in understanding the legality of the proceedings and in demonstrating that he was cooperating without conceding wrongdoing. His hands, still tingling from the earlier restraints, moved steadily as he reviewed each line, maintaining focus and clarity. During this pause, he allowed his thoughts to drift momentarily to the broader consequences of the arrest. How would the public react? How would his colleagues in the judiciary respond? What impact would this incident have on the perception of justice and law enforcement in the city? These reflections were not distractions, but rather a way to ground himself, to remind himself of the larger context in which this personal ordeal was unfolding. The Chief Justice had always believed that individual actions could ripple outward, affecting many, and he was acutely aware that his own conduct in this moment could influence others. As the hours passed, the tone in the room shifted subtly. Officers who had initially displayed confidence now moved more cautiously, their gestures more measured. Whispers of doubt and concern floated through the air. The Chief Justice noted these changes with quiet satisfaction, understanding that patience and consistency were slowly reshaping the dynamic. He continued to speak only when necessary, carefully choosing words that reinforced calm, authority, and ethical reasoning. Occasionally, an officer would approach with a question or request clarification. The Chief Justice responded with thoughtful explanations, never defensive, never aggressive. His responses demonstrated not only his knowledge of legal procedures, but also his understanding of human behavior and ethical responsibility. He emphasized fairness, transparency, and the importance of upholding the law without prejudice. By addressing concerns with clarity and respect, he subtly guided the officers toward reflection and accountability. During a moment of quiet, he reflected on his own values and the lessons he had learned over decades of service. Justice, he knew, was more than rules. It was about humanity, empathy, and the courage to act rightly even when faced with adversity. He considered the young officers present, realizing that their future decisions could be influenced by what they were witnessing. By modeling composure, integrity, and patience, he hoped to impart a subtle but powerful lesson about the true nature of authority. The Chief Justice's thoughts then turned to the people outside the station, citizens, colleagues, and journalists who might be following the story. He understood that the narrative of this event could shape public perception and influence broader societal trust in institutions. This awareness reinforced his commitment to acting with dignity, demonstrating that even in the face of injustice, principled conduct could prevail. He remained attentive, observing each subtle shift in demeanor, each hesitant gesture, and each glance exchanged among the officers. At one point, a more senior officer entered the room with a folder of reports. The Chief Justice welcomed him politely, engaging in a measured conversation about procedures, expectations, and the next steps. He remained calm and precise, answering questions thoroughly while also highlighting inconsistencies and ambiguities in the process. The officer seemed increasingly aware of the unusual nature of the arrest and began to adjust his approach accordingly, speaking with more caution and deliberation. As the review of his detention continued, the Chief Justice noticed a growing sense of unease among the officers. Their confidence had waned, replaced by reflection and uncertainty. He realized that by maintaining his composure, demonstrating patience, and carefully observing human behavior, he was slowly shifting the dynamic in the room. Authority, he understood, was not solely about rank or power. It was also about presence, clarity, and moral integrity. During a brief pause, he allowed himself to reflect on the personal impact of the ordeal. The humiliation and vulnerability he had experienced were real, but he drew strength from his principles and his commitment to justice. He reminded himself that resilience was not about denying fear or discomfort, but about facing them with clarity and dignity. Every moment of patience, every carefully considered response, was an act of quiet strength that reinforced his character and authority. Time moved slowly, yet the Chief Justice remained steady. He engaged with officers when necessary, observing, listening, and responding thoughtfully. He avoided confrontation, understanding that measured actions and words were far more effective than impulsive reactions. His calm presence seemed to encourage reflection among the officers, who increasingly questioned the rationale behind their actions and the treatment of someone of his stature. As the hours continued, the Chief Justice reflected on the broader lessons of the incident. He considered the importance of accountability, the responsibility of those in positions of authority, and the impact of human behavior on justice and fairness. He understood that the situation, though deeply personal and challenging, offered an opportunity to influence the attitudes and decisions of others positively. By maintaining integrity, patience, and composure, he could demonstrate the true meaning of authority and ethical conduct. The Chief Justice also focused on the small details of the environment, recognizing that observation was crucial. He noted the placement of cameras, the behavior of officers, and the interactions between staff members. Every subtle gesture, glance, and movement provided insight into the attitudes and intentions of those around him. By staying attentive, he could anticipate reactions and adapt his approach, ensuring that his actions remained deliberate and effective. Eventually, the Chief Justice was informed that the review of the arrest was progressing, and that further decisions would be made soon. He accepted this information with calm patience, understanding that endurance and strategic composure were key in navigating this challenging situation. He continued to maintain dignity, observing, reflecting, and preparing mentally for the next steps. He knew that his actions in this moment could have lasting implications, both personally and for the broader perception of justice and law enforcement. Throughout Part 4, the Chief Justice remained a model of resilience, integrity, and thoughtful action. Despite the humiliation, uncertainty, and tension, he demonstrated that authority rooted in moral clarity, patience, and ethical conduct could influence even the most challenging circumstances. His behavior subtly shaped the attitudes of those around him, highlighting the power of composure, reflection, and principled action in the face of adversity. By the end of Part 4, the Chief Justice had not only survived a prolonged period of uncertainty and scrutiny, but had also subtly shifted the environment in his favor. Through observation, patience, and deliberate communication, he maintained dignity, asserted authority without aggression, and laid the groundwork for the resolution of this unprecedented situation. The experience tested his resilience, judgment, and humanity, reinforcing his commitment to justice, integrity, and the ethical exercise of authority. He asked about the reason for his detention and sought clarity on the procedures being followed. The senior officer provided a cautious response, speaking of protocol and orders, but it was evident that even he was unsure about the justification for the arrest. The Chief Justice listened attentively, nodding slightly, acknowledging the explanation without conceding that it was valid. His calm demeanor and measured words seemed to influence the atmosphere, drawing attention to the absurdity and seriousness of the situation simultaneously. The Chief Justice was guided to another room, a slightly more private area for further questioning and processing. As he walked, he maintained a steady pace, his posture upright, conveying confidence and authority even in this vulnerable state. He noticed the cameras in the corners, the subtle sounds of doors closing, and the occasional footsteps echoing in the hallways. Every detail mattered, he reminded himself, for these observations could be useful later, either as evidence or as a reflection of human behavior under pressure. Inside the room, he was asked to sit at a table. Documents were placed before him, and officers began reviewing information, occasionally glancing up at him. The Chief Justice focused on remaining calm, his breathing steady, his mind organized. He understood that fear could be contagious, but so could composure and clarity. By maintaining his own equilibrium, he could influence the tone of the interactions and encourage a more thoughtful, less reactive environment. Questions were asked, some repetitive, some irrelevant, and a few designed to unsettle him. The Chief Justice answered each with clarity and patience, never raising his voice, never showing signs of distress. His words were chosen carefully, aiming to convey honesty, integrity, and an understanding of human behavior. He knew that demonstrating calm and rational thought in the face of unjust treatment would leave a stronger impression than anger or panic ever could. As the interrogation continued, he noticed subtle changes in the officer's demeanor. Hesitation became more pronounced, and some exchanged glances as if realizing that detaining the Chief Justice was a serious error. Their attempts to assert dominance were weakening, replaced by uncertainty and quiet reflection. The Chief Justice recognized the power of patience and observation in such moments. By remaining composed and engaged, he subtly shifted the dynamic in his favor. While the officers discussed amongst themselves, the Chief Justice allowed his mind to wander briefly. He thought about the people who trusted him, the colleagues in the judiciary, and the broader implications of this incident. He considered the importance of public perception, the responsibility of those in positions of authority, and the need for accountability. Despite the personal humiliation he felt, he understood that his behavior and decisions in this moment could influence more than just his own circumstances. They could set an example for the treatment of justice and fairness in society. He reflected on his own career, on the countless cases he had presided over, and the principles he had upheld. He thought about times when he had faced challenging situations, difficult decisions, and moments of intense scrutiny. Each memory reinforced his resolve. Experience had taught him that dignity and patience were powerful tools, sometimes more effective than confrontation or force. This understanding guided him as he continued to navigate the interrogation, projecting calm authority while absorbing every detail of the environment. The Chief Justice observed the reactions of the officers closely. Some were younger, inexperienced, and clearly intimidated. Others were seasoned, trying to maintain a professional front, but their gestures betrayed doubt. He noted the subtle tension, the quick shifts in posture, and the glances exchanged between them. These small human cues offered insight into their state of mind and suggested that, beneath their uniforms, they were susceptible to reason, conscience, and accountability. At one point, a more senior officer approached with a stack of papers and a tablet, indicating that the Chief Justice needed to review certain documents. He complied quietly, flipping through pages with methodical attention. Each document, each form, and each procedure was examined not only to comply but to understand the process fully. By demonstrating careful attention and respect for detail, he reinforced his composure and authority subtly, reminding the officers that he was not easily rattled. The Chief Justice spoke occasionally, calmly inquiring about procedures, the purpose of the forms, and the expected outcomes. His questions were deliberate, aimed at clarifying the situation while highlighting inconsistencies in the officers' actions. He maintained a neutral tone, never accusatory, but his words carried weight. The officers, despite their initial confidence, began to recognize that their actions were being scrutinized with precision and clarity, which unsettled some and humbled others. Outside the room, the sounds of activity continued: footsteps, doors opening and closing, and distant conversations. The Chief Justice focused on these sounds, treating them as background data, a context for understanding the environment. He recognized that awareness of surroundings, attention to detail, and patience were crucial. By observing without reacting impulsively, he preserved his energy and maintained strategic composure, a skill that had served him throughout his career. As time passed, he noticed that the tone of the officers in the room shifted subtly. Questions became more cautious, gestures slower, and their interactions with one another more measured. The Chief Justice understood that calm authority could influence human behavior. By remaining patient, collected, and observant, he was slowly changing the dynamic, encouraging officers to reconsider their actions and approach with more thoughtfulness. During the pauses between questioning, he reflected on human behavior and the nature of authority. He thought about how individuals in positions of power could misuse their influence and how important it was to balance authority with conscience. He realized that this incident, though challenging and deeply humiliating, offered a unique perspective on accountability, empathy, and the responsibilities of those who enforce the law. He drew strength from these reflections, maintaining mental clarity and emotional stability. Eventually, an officer returned with a message indicating that a review of the arrest was underway. The Chief Justice listened attentively as the details were explained. While the information was limited, he could sense that doubt was creeping in among the officers and that the incident was being evaluated more carefully. He maintained his calm demeanor, understanding that patience and observation would be more effective than immediate confrontation. By continuing to project authority through composure and clarity, he subtly influenced the unfolding process. As Part 3 of this ordeal progressed, the Chief Justice remained focused, resilient, and aware. He continued to observe, listen, and engage thoughtfully, knowing that every word, every gesture, and every pause mattered. His reflections reinforced his commitment to justice, integrity, and dignity. Though the situation remained tense, he felt a quiet strength growing within him, a determination to navigate this challenging experience with calm authority and unwavering resolve. He considered the broader implications of the incident, how it could impact public trust, the perception of law enforcement, and the principles of justice. He understood that his behavior in this room could influence not only the immediate outcome, but also set a precedent for accountability and fairness. This awareness strengthened his resolve to remain composed, thoughtful, and deliberate in every action and word. By the end of Part 3, the Chief Justice had not only survived a deeply challenging ordeal, but had also begun to subtly shift the atmosphere around him. Through observation, patience, and careful communication, he maintained dignity, asserted authority without aggression, and laid the groundwork for the next phase of this unprecedented situation. The experience tested his resilience, judgment, and humanity, reinforcing his commitment to justice and the ethical exercise of authority. Expressions hard, their actions unyielding. Witnesses in the crowd began to shout, some calling out for the officers to stop, others simply expressing their surprise. The Chief Justice felt a mix of humiliation and fear. He was a man used to respect and authority, but in that moment he was vulnerable. His pleas for understanding and mercy fell on deaf ears. Every step he took toward the officers was cautious, measured, trying not to provoke further aggression. He was conscious of the cameras, the phones, the recording devices capturing every detail of the unfolding event. The handcuffs were tightened around his wrists. He tried to remain calm even as panic threatened to rise within him. He reflected on the irony of the situation. He had spent his life ensuring that the law protected the innocent and punished the guilty. He had worked tirelessly to make sure that justice was impartial and fair. And yet here he was, at the mercy of individuals who had chosen to disregard those principles entirely. The Chief Justice's mind raced. He thought about the cases he had presided over, the people who had relied on his judgments, and the countless hours he had spent studying and interpreting the law. He had always believed in the integrity of the system, that ultimately fairness and truth would prevail. But the scene unfolding in front of him suggested otherwise. The officers' actions were not just a personal affront. They were a symbol of a deeper issue, a reflection of the prejudices and abuses that could exist within positions of authority. As he was led toward a waiting police vehicle, the Chief Justice continued to speak, his voice steady despite the situation. He urged the officers to consider the consequences of their actions, to remember the responsibilities they carried, and to act with honor and dignity. But the officers remained silent, focused on their orders, seemingly indifferent to his words. The crowd around him grew restless, and some began to record the scene in earnest, capturing every detail of the unfolding injustice. In the vehicle, as the doors closed and the engine started, the Chief Justice felt a profound sense of isolation. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone in the experience. His thoughts turned inward, reflecting on his life, his career, and the principles he had upheld. Despite the fear and humiliation, there was a determination in him, a recognition that his identity and integrity were not diminished by the actions of those who sought to undermine him. The drive to the station was tense and silent. Officers who were part of the convoy avoided eye contact, and the Chief Justice was left to contemplate the events that had led to this moment. He thought about the fragility of respect and authority, and how quickly it could be challenged or taken away. The city outside passed by in a blur, but within the vehicle time seemed suspended, each minute stretching with wait and anticipation. By the time the Chief Justice arrived at the station, he was mentally preparing for what lay ahead. He knew that the moments to come would test not only his resilience, but also the very principles of justice he had devoted his life to upholding. He steeled himself, understanding that his conduct, calmness, and clarity would be his tools in facing an unjust and unpredictable situation. The reality was harsh, but within him burned a quiet determination to endure and to maintain dignity even in the face of wrongful treatment. The officers opened the vehicle doors, and the Chief Justice stepped out. The crowd outside the station had grown larger, some curious, some supportive, and some critical of the unfolding events. Flashbulbs from cameras went off, and the murmurs of bystanders filled the air. Each step toward the station's entrance felt heavy, weighted with the significance of what was happening. But the Chief Justice held his head high, a symbol of resilience amidst chaos. As he was guided inside, the Chief Justice continued to speak, calmly addressing those around him, trying to de-escalate tension, to remind everyone of the importance of law and fairness. He understood that his composure. The Chief Justice sat in the waiting area, his hands still tingling from the handcuffs that had been removed moments before. The room was cold, sterile, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and metal. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the plain walls. Outside the small windows, the city carried on unaware, but inside, the Chief Justice felt trapped in a bubble of tension and uncertainty. He had always known that justice was not just about rules and laws, but about people and choices. Today, he was experiencing firsthand how fragile respect and authority could be when met with ignorance and prejudice. He looked around and noticed the other officers present, some watching him intently, others looking away, uncomfortable, It was clear that there was confusion among them. They had taken someone of immense importance and influence, and did not fully understand the gravity of their actions. The Chief Justice realized that this confusion might work to his advantage, but only if he remained calm and composed. Panic or anger could worsen the situation, and he needed to maintain control of himself even if he could not control the circumstances. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as officers moved back and forth. Papers were shuffled, phones rang quietly, and conversations were held in hushed tones. Occasionally, a younger officer would glance at the Chief Justice, perhaps recognizing him from public appearances or news coverage, and a fleeting look of doubt or guilt would cross their face. He saw that, and he knew that beneath the uniformed facade, there were individuals capable of understanding right from wrong. This gave him a small measure of hope. When one of the senior officers finally approached, he spoke in a tone that tried to assert authority, but was tinged with uncertainty. He asked the Chief Justice to provide identification and to answer a few standard questions. The Chief Justice complied quietly, handing over his documents and answering politely, though every word was weighed carefully. He had learned over decades that words could be weapons as well as shields, and today he needed both. The interrogation was not aggressive, but it was invasive. Questions came rapidly, some relevant, others absurd, designed to unsettle him. The Chief Justice noticed that some officers seemed uncomfortable asking certain questions, as if they were aware that their target was someone far above their rank and position. They tried to maintain an air of control, but the room was charged with tension. He answered each question with calm clarity, never raising his voice, never showing the panic or fear that churned within him. As the questioning continued, the Chief Justice's mind wandered briefly to his family. He thought about his children, about how they would hear of this incident and worry. He thought about his colleagues in the judiciary, about how they would react. The thought of letting fear or anger take control was tempting, but he resisted. Instead, he focused on the present, on the need to maintain dignity and composure. He knew that how he acted now would be remembered and interpreted by everyone in that room, and by anyone who might hear about this later. The officers began to discuss among themselves. Their conversation was low and cautious, but the Chief Justice could catch fragments. There were mentions of protocol, procedure, and orders. It was clear that the arrest had caused a ripple of unease through the department. He realized that sometimes fear came not from the person you were confronting, but from the potential consequences of your actions. The officers were beginning to understand that detaining someone of his stature was not a simple matter, and that realization was already starting to work in his favor. He took a deep breath and decided to speak, his voice calm but firm. He addressed the officers directly, reminding them of the principles they had sworn to uphold, of the importance of justice, fairness, and restraint. He spoke not as a judge delivering a sentence, but as a human being appealing to their conscience. He reminded them that their actions would be remembered and that respect once lost was hard to regain. There were pauses, brief moments of silence as his words sank in. Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Others glanced away and a few nodded subtly. Despite his composure, he could not ignore the humiliation he felt. Being handcuffed and detained by people who had sworn to serve the law was a blow to his pride, and he acknowledged it silently. He understood that feelings of humiliation were natural, but he also recognized that allowing those feelings to dominate would not serve him. He had faced difficult and challenging moments before, but nothing had prepared him for the raw vulnerability of being on the receiving end of such treatment in front of strangers. As the waiting continued, the Chief Justice observed the room in detail. There were security cameras in the corners, their lenses glinting in the overhead light. Officers were stationed strategically, some near the doors, some close to the desks. He noted their body language, the subtle signs of hesitation or nervousness. He realized that in situations like this, observation was as important as speech. By understanding the room, he could anticipate reactions and adapt his approach. Every glance, every small movement told a story, and he read it carefully. Eventually, the Chief Justice was told that he would be moved to a more private area for further processing. As he was guided through narrow hallways, he kept his steps measured, his head held high. There were whispers and glances from other officers, some uncertain, some curious. People passing by in the corridors could not fully comprehend the significance of the man they saw being led through the station. But the Chief Justice carried himself with the quiet authority that had defined him throughout his career. In the private room, he was asked to wait again. The Chief Justice reflected on the irony of his situation. He had spent decades interpreting and enforcing the law, defending citizens against abuses and advocating for fairness. Yet here he was, subjected to an experience that was the very opposite of justice. It was a reminder that the law was only as strong as those who upheld it, and that human prejudice could undermine even the most established systems. During this pause, he allowed himself a moment of introspection. He thought about the broader implications of this incident, about how easily power could be misused, and how vigilance was required at all levels to ensure accountability. He considered the lessons he had learned over his life: patience, observation, restraint, and the importance of understanding human behavior. Those lessons were now being tested under circumstances he had never imagined. Minutes later, a senior officer entered, carrying papers and looking more composed than the others. The Chief Justice greeted him politely and calmly, speaking with a clarity that commanded attention without aggression. He asked questions about the purpose of his detention, seeking to understand the reasoning behind the arrest. The senior officer replied cautiously, citing vague procedures and protocol. But it was clear even to him that the justification was weak. The Chief Justice listened carefully, responding thoughtfully. He maintained a tone that was firm yet respectful, demonstrating the balance of authority and humility that had always guided him. He knew that every word and every action in this room mattered, not just for his immediate situation, but for the precedent it could set for the treatment of others. He chose his words deliberately, emphasizing fairness, legality, and the ethical responsibilities of those in uniform. Throughout this time, he noticed subtle shifts in the attitudes of the officers around him. Hesitation became more pronounced, and some began to question whether their actions were justified. The Chief Justice understood that human behavior often changed when confronted with calm authority, especially when that authority carried moral and ethical weight. He remained composed, continuing to speak with a quiet confidence that gradually began to influence the room. Eventually, after what felt like an extended period, the Chief Justice was informed that there would be a review of the incident. He was told that further decisions would be made soon, and that in the meantime he would remain in a secure waiting area. He accepted this with patience, understanding that some battles were won by endurance rather than immediate action. He focused on maintaining his composure, observing the environment, and preparing mentally for the next phase of this challenging day. As he waited, he reflected on the strength of the legal system and the importance of integrity within its ranks. He knew that mistakes, biases, and human error were inevitable, but that the pursuit of justice required vigilance, courage, and resilience. The experience was deeply personal, yet it reinforced the principles he had upheld throughout his career. Despite the fear, uncertainty, and humiliation, he remained steadfast in his commitment to fairness and justice. The Chief Justice also thought about the people outside the station. Citizens, journalists, and colleagues would be watching, and their perception of the law was now intertwined with this incident. He understood that his behavior in this room could influence public opinion and potentially impact broader societal trust in institutions. This realization strengthened his resolve to remain calm, dignified, and thoughtful, no matter how trying the circumstances. Time continued to pass slowly. The Chief Justice remained seated, observing, listening, and reflecting. He understood that this moment, though challenging, was a test of character. He drew upon years of experience, knowledge, and wisdom, reminding himself that authority and respect were not defined by fear or intimidation, but by consistency, integrity, and ethical conduct. This perspective allowed him to maintain inner calm, even as the external situation remained uncertain. As part 2 of this ordeal came to a close, the Chief Justice felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief that he had managed to maintain composure, influence the room subtly, and navigate the tense interactions with skill. Anticipation for what was to come, knowing that the next steps could determine the outcome not only for him personally, but for the principles of justice he represented. With patience, clarity, and quiet determination, he prepared to face the next chapter of this unprecedented experience, ready to uphold dignity, fairness, and authority even under immense pressure. would be a shield against the indignities he was about to face. Inside, the environment was stark and unwelcoming, a place meant for processing and detention, not for dialogue or understanding. Yet he remained steady, aware that every word and action mattered. The handcuffs were removed and he was seated in a waiting area. He took a moment to breathe deeply, centering himself, reflecting on the strange turn of events that had led him from the heights of authority to this room of uncertainty. Despite the fear and frustration, he felt a sense of clarity. This was not the end of his journey, but a moment of trial, a test of patience, resilience, and the unwavering belief in justice and truth.